I'll call the study session for this Newport Beach City Council for October 13th to order. May we have the roll call, please?
The record will reflect that all members of council are present except for Councilmember Rosansky.
Okay. I believe before we get into current business, our city manager has an announcement he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I want to introduce to you Jan Perkins. Jan is our interim assistant city manager, and maybe, Jan, if you'd like to maybe stand up and say hello. Jan will give a little bit of her background, and she's been invaluable to me and to the organization just the past, I think, 3 weeks she's been here. But welcome to Jan.
Okay. Thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here helping out the city of Newport Beach and attending my first city council meeting. So it's nice to meet all of you in this venue. I do have a background, of course, in city government. I spent about 30 years working for a variety of cities, the last 2 of which were up in the Bay Area. I was city manager of Fremont and Morgan Hill. But before that, I was in Orange County, and I was the assistant city manager in Santa Ana a number of years ago, and started my career in Michigan. So got a kind of a well-rounded background in city government. For the last 4 years, I have been doing local government consulting, working with cities and counties and special districts of all sizes, from very small districts of 12 employees to very large cities like the city of San Jose. So covering all kinds of work ranging from organizational reviews to facilitation of goal setting to just a whole variety of feasibility studies and a variety of things. So happy to be here, do whatever I can to help Dave, to help the staff and help the City Council, and I'll look forward to getting to know you. Thank you.
Well, welcome. We look forward to getting to know you and working with you also. Okay, current business, clarification of items on the consent calendar. Councilwoman Daigle?
Yes, S21, I believe, the MLPA is on the consent calendar. And so I did have a question for you, Dave. I know there's been a little bit of discussion to possibly, instead of considering a boundary of 2 miles or 3 miles that way, that we would look more to depth of something like 50 feet, which is where the Rocky Intertidal would be. Or, I mean, if you could kind of clarify that a little bit.
Yes, Mr. Mayor and council members and Councilmember Daigle, that as you indicated, there may be some benefit to looking at the city's position in the context of protecting the Rocky Intertidal Zone. And the Rocky Intertidal Zone varies. It's not something as simple as saying, well, you should go X amount of feet out. So the concept would be maybe looking at whether or not you should set a depth limit and say that the depth limit is 50 feet in depth or 25 feet in depth. Michelle Clementi will be here a little later, I think, because the expectation is we'd actually pull that from the consent calendar because it needs something plugged into it.
Okay.
So she'll be prepared to talk about that this evening.
Okay. And then with that, the thinking being, that habitat has the structures that bring the fish, attract the fish.
Right.
Okay. And then also what your thoughts are is that we would affirm and maintain our existing level of protection.
That's what the resolution attempts to do, to say that we protected this in the past. We hope to protect it in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Councilwoman Gardner?
Number 11, which is the Newport Beach Film Festival grant agreement. Now, this is I'm assuming, the money that we've already approved. I mean, this is not in addition. And also had a question. It says, it is our understanding that future requests by the film festival will be reviewed by the Special Events Advisory Committee. Is that anticipating future requests this year, or just future requests in general, that from now on the Special Events Committee will be reviewing this sort of thing?
I was thinking it would be in the future, the next annual request, because they are one of the 3 or 4 requests that meets that threshold that was set when you established the Special Event Committee.
Councilman Webb?
I have none.
Councilman Hen?
Nothing.
Mayor Pro Tem Curry?
No items?
I have one item, number 12. It's the amendment to the professional services agreement with LSA.
Mr. Mayor, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I heard word that we're pulling that because LSA has agreed to include that cost in their existing contract. You could make the comment anyway. It's up to you.
Well, yeah, maybe I will. I guess I'm just concerned about the cost of these EIRs and how we deal with the EIR consultants. And I've kind of not said a lot about these when they've come before us because we've had all these important projects we're doing. But as I look at the sum total of the EIRs and what they're costing us, and some of them are costing project proponents that are doing private development. 3 of them are city projects, Sunset Ridge and the Civic Center and Marina Park, in the cost of these things and how we're going about them. And I guess I just have a concern that we're not really managing these things tight enough. The cost, I mean, you know, I'll just, even without the $37,000, $475,000 or whatever it is for that EIR. I looked at that EIR sitting on my desk, and as I was telling Dave this morning, it's 2 years of his salary. And I'm looking at that EIR and saying, is that really, are we getting that kind of value out of this? So it just really bothers me, and I just
We're
like to
killing a lot
see
of
us-
trees for it.
Yeah. That, you know, that we should be looking into these processes and how we contract with the EIR consultants, and not only that, but how we manage them. I mean, just some of the stuff I saw in here that they were analyzing multiple drafts of traffic studies all of the time on the Native American issue. It just seemed like a lot of expensive time, and I just wonder what value we get out of it. So those are my comments.
Can I completely agree with that? And I would add, you know, even when we had the Marina Park one, which was an addendum, I think like $80,000, and when I asked the reason, the response was to respond to comment letters, which really ought to be responding to information already in the body of the document. And so when it's not, there's an amendment, and it really begs the question, why wasn't the original scope of the project contain that? So I agree with all of your concerns that you have previously expressed.
Okay. All right. We'll go on to our first discussion item, which is the Corona Del Mar Parking Management Study.
I believe Lee DeSantis is going to do our presentation here.
Lee DeSantis, Economic Development Administrator. Good afternoon. This is the second of the 5 studies that we've been working on to come to you as part of a study session. And we will have Mark Linsenmeyer of Walker Parking make a presentation. We've asked him to not go back over the initial data on how we've been conducting these studies that you heard last time, and to get directly into the issues that are related to Corona Del Mar, and hopefully take only about half the time, so then you can discuss what is being revealed by the study and provide some direction as to how we proceed before we come back for specific action. So with that, let me introduce Mark Linsenmeyer of Walker Parking Consultants.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Mark Linsenmeyer with Walker Parking Consultants. And as Lee mentioned, this is, I think, the first study we kind of worked on as part of our engagement. The second one that's coming before council. Let me cue it up here. We had some specific goals that we wanted to look at, actually the rather broad goals. But you know, when we kind of come in and start this, we want to make sure that we're maintaining the ambiance, the economic vitality, and the balanced growth of the residential and commercial areas throughout Newport Beach, and in this one specifically in Corona Del Mar. We also want to make sure that there's adequate parking available to those who need it. And we want to make the parking system as efficient as possible. So not only provide the parking, but make sure the circulation and the movement in that system is efficient. For this one, we looked at a fairly, I guess, long study area. It goes essentially from Avocado, kind of in the northwest corner, down to Hazel, primarily looking at the commercial core along Coast Highway. Obviously, there's a good mix of land uses generating the increasing amount of parking in this area. Much of the parking, as it currently stands, is free, including the spaces along Coast Highway. But we do see congestion in specific areas. And one of the things that we want to kind of identify and watch is the encroachment and spillover from the commercial uses into the residential areas. And in Corona Del Mar, that was kind of one of the primary concerns or primary issues that we wanted to look at when we were developing our recommendations. As Lee mentioned, I'll just kind of go through this quickly, but I just wanted to bring you back to how we did it. You know, primarily with our field surveys, looking at the inventory counts, the number of parking spaces, doing occupancy counts on weekdays and weekends at specific peak period times. You know, reviewed some of the previous studies, and then, you know, looking at some of the parking management concepts and techniques that we could apply to ameliorate some of the parking issues. The baseline that we do is we want to improve the efficiency of the system. As you know, throughout Orange County, throughout Southern California, the population in the area is increasing, even in these economic downturns. But the parking generally remains flat. So we have more people competing for the same number of spaces. As a result, in commercial areas, we feel that the turnover in the spaces, the turning of the spaces, is critical to make sure that people have access to the areas. Free on-street parking distorts some of this incentive to turn over spaces. However, we think that if we, you know, appropriately manage the parking, we can help some of this. But that does require trade-offs between the different user groups, between the commercial and merchants and the residents and the visitors in the area. One of the things that we look at is, you know, is there a way to price the parking to help with this? And so we looked at that as one of the solutions in Corona Del Mar. And it's obviously the easiest and most obvious one in some areas as well. Just going back quickly on the supply and demand, you can see that primarily the demand or the inventory in this area is on-street parking. There's over 2,000 spaces on-street in that study area that I showed on the previous screen. And there's about 1,400 off-street parking. And this doesn't include the larger Corona Del Mar Plaza lot, but just in smaller lots and the one small city public lot. So there's about 3,400 parking.
Did that include resident parking or just in the commercial strip?
It includes the commercial strip, and I guess, you know, on behind those, on some of the coast highway areas, there's lots for the businesses, and so it doesn't include the private residential.
And the on-street doesn't go back to the residences, that's just coast highway?
The
and then
on-street does go back to the residential.
Oh, it does?
But, yeah.
One block, not to the alley, but a full block.
Right. So we did some occupancy on this, and again, these are just kind of order of magnitude numbers. So we looked at, you know, the 10 a.m., the morning, afternoon, and evening counts on Thursday. Looks like it was May 15th, and Saturday, May 17th, and, you know, somewhere between just over half and just under 2/3 of the parking system was occupied. It's a little bit distorted since there is a good amount of off-street parking in here. But by and large, it looks like it's busy but not completely gridlocked. However, one of the things we did notice as we go through this is there are specific areas where their parking is severely impacted, and some areas where it's readily available. And this is kind of what we do as sort of a visual to look at how it is impacted. As you can see on the up towards Carnation, MacArthur on the coast side of things. There are some heavily impacted areas. Those are meant to be, you know, sort of the orange and red areas. But there is some available parking nearby. And this is at the 10 a.m., which is actually when the peak occupancy counts were system-wide. So there's levels of impacted parking, but also areas nearby where if people wanted to walk a block or so, that they could probably find parking. That doesn't mean that there's not issues with it, but it does mean there's solutions available to it.
I can't really read all those colored lines from here, but what was your conclusion of the parking situation at Iris and Jasmine, where the Albertson Center is? Is that over impacted like the Carnation area is, or?
It's not as impacted. You know, again, it's busy and there's a lot of circulation and a good amount of turnover. And as you're looking at on the coast highway side of it through that center. There is some availability. There's not as many spaces down there, mind you, but it's not as severely impacted as in other areas. And in particular, as we get into some of the evening counts where the system as a whole isn't as busy, But again, there's, isolated spaces or spots where it's impacted. And again, we'll go back up to, like, looking at the Avocado or the Coast Highway between Avocado, Carnation, or Dahlia, and we can see some intensified areas of impact.
Can you orient us to your map a little bit more? What some of the main streets are there?
Yeah, I mean, do we have a...
And may I add that on page 3 of your staff report is a colored map that shows the red areas only, which makes it much easier to read. So you might want to take a quick glance at that, page 3 of the staff report.
So where would Marguerite be up there? Okay.
So there's heliotrope, iris, that'd be jasmine, and then I believe that's Marguerite right through there.
Okay.
And here's Coast Highway that kind of comes down through here. And so again, we'll see areas where it is impacted, and some of these areas definitely show that. But you can see with the yellow, which is 70 to 75 or 70 to 79% occupied, that there are available spaces on street. So we do think that there's issues, and we do think that it's crowded. But even driving through there this morning, you can kind of notice that there's a lot of cars in the area, but there's also some available spaces. Some of the impact, I think, on Coast Highway is, of course, that it's a highway. And so as you're trying to parallel park on Coast Highway to get some of those spaces, it's somewhat of a tenuous exercise because, cars are kind of coming up behind you constantly. So it's a little frightening. As part of our study, we ended up choosing an area to do a license plate inventory, or what we would call a turnover analysis. And again, this is the area, I guess that would be just kind of southwest of Coast Highway between Avocado and Dahlia, going again 1 block deep, just looking at the on-street spaces and trying to identify where vehicles were parking and how often they were or how long they were parked there. And the Coast Highway spaces, and there's not as many of those, typically have a 1-hour limit, and the spaces here are typically unregulated in terms of how long vehicles can park there. So we do have some variances in the time restrictions or the parking management issues within this area. But as you can see from sort of the explanation here, in this area there's 112 parking spaces, and we saw throughout our 10 or 11-hour counts 411 vehicles coming into those spaces. So, there's right around, 3.67 vehicles per parking space throughout the day, throughout I think it was 8 a.m. till 7 p.m. count that we did. However, we also noticed that there were 90 cars that were parked more than 5 hours. So it's not saying they were in violation of the 1-hour limit by any means, but that they were sort of, stored there all day, indicating that they're likely either residents or employees, and not necessarily visitors or shoppers to the area. So, we kind of want to identify if there's a way to turn over those spaces so that we can use them more efficiently, so that people that are coming down to the area to patronize the shops or to go to restaurants have access to them. So can we move some of the employees into perhaps the city lot down here on 4th between Carnation and Dahlia, or kind of spread the vehicles out, or get some of the residential vehicles into their garages or parking areas. Some of the ways that we look at in our report to do this is through what we would call transportation demand management techniques or parking demand management techniques on the terminal end of those things, and looking at different ways to again, mitigate the number of vehicles in the area. And, we look at such things such as, public transit, alternative transportation, carpools, van pools, any sort of employee incentives we can get to limit employees arriving down into this area on single occupancy vehicles. Also looked at pricing. Is there any benefit to pricing some of this area? Not necessarily as a way to generate revenue, but just as a way to sort of enforce turnover and encourage turnover. We also looked at parking signage. I know there is that I think it's 31 space lot down on 4th Street between Carnation and Dahlia, and is there adequate signs to get cars into that area? Can we direct vehicles off of Coast Highway into that off-street lot? Can we get vehicles that are trying to get down to the beach beach lots? We looked at that for both the parking signage and what we call a parking guidance system. And again, that's just showing, if it's appropriate, the number of spaces available either on street or in some of these lots to get cars queued up and going into those areas. We also looked at different ways to sort of manage these initiatives, and we looked at in lieu fees as to whether that would be appropriate. We also looked at that as part of our zoning document, which is a separate report that we had prepared. And also looking at parking benefit districts and parking assessment districts, which I can talk about in a little more detail here in a second. But essentially, when we looked at the impact and looked at what we saw, we came up with a couple different alternatives that we wanted to bring before council and that we brought to the steering committee. One of those is to meter the on-street commercial areas, which is, of course, in this instance, Coast Highway, and kind of get cars that are trying to park on Coast Highway to sort of understand that it's not for storage, that they should be turning those over, and it does have a 1-hour time limit now. I'm not sure. We didn't really study how that was enforced or if it's enforced. We know it's a challenge to enforce time limits on busy streets like that. And we also talked about, if we do put meters in or paid parking in on Coast Highway, that'll encourage some people to spill over into the residential areas, a block or 2 blocks in from Coast Highway. So we want to limit that. And so we thought, well, is it possible to put time limits in there or to meter those areas, or some way to mitigate the impact of the spillover? We also talked about on-street permit parking, creating a residential permit parking area in this neighborhood, and if that would have any value or if that has any interest in terms of the residents warming up to this. And again, there's some issues with the California Coastal Commission on permitting some of this, because the areas kind of southwest of Coast Highway are in the coastal zone. And we also talked about increasing the opportunities to use private off-street parking. And again, that's just kind of the shared parking idea, that we know that there's some busy restaurants in the area that get busy in the evenings, and we also know that there's some banks and other sort of daytime use businesses that might be agreeable to sharing their parking supply with some of those restaurants.
When you looked at the private off-street parking, did you, there's quite a bit of parking. I call it at-risk parking. They're parking lots that are zoned for other uses, and they're not tied in by the zoning code to the buildings that are using them. So at any point in time, these people could theoretically take and change those parking lots into some other use. Do you have a feel for how many spaces are in that category?
Not specifically. I know we looked at sort of the individual lots as they were, sort of adjacent to those uses. But I don't think we kind of delved into where the parking requirements were tied to which use and to which building or to which property.
It doesn't happen very often, but a couple of years ago, or maybe it's more than a couple now, on Goldenrod, part of the parking was lost to, I think, 2 single-family homes were built there, if I remember correctly. They just took the parking out, and it was gone.
Yeah, and so those kinds of issues.
Must be because they reoriented the lots to where they didn't have to park in the alley, huh?
No.
Yeah, and a lot of those issues, especially in sort of a mature commercial area, it's a dangerous situation because as we've seen in Corona del Mar specifically, as you change some of the uses going from retail to restaurant, the parking demand for those different uses is dramatically different. So it's hard to balance the sort of economic development incentives and the parking. And it does create, some inverse agglomeration effects. It's good to have a lot of restaurants right next to each other for their business, but for parking, it does create some concerns and some issues. But we still think, within this, there's, again, areas of impact that we think if we just move some cars around and maybe open up, I think specifically that lot on 4th Street between Carnation and Dahlia, that it may alleviate some of the pressure in that area, since that's kind of the area of greatest impact. Obviously, as we get down towards that Albertson Center and those areas where we have the public market on the weekends, there's sort of event parking issues with those as well. But we also talk a bit about creating a parking benefit district. That's what the PBD stands for. And we've talked about this in other areas as well as we're moving through this process. And is there a way to, sort of get the landowners, the residents, the business owners involved in helping manage and monitor some of this parking? Is there a way that they can support the city's initiatives with directing parking and increasing supply, increasing turnover, that there's a way for them to support it, to provide some oversight along with the city, and to help with the monitoring? And I think the thing that we've kind of arrived at in Corona Del Mar is that it's going to be important, regardless of our recommendations or what the city wants to do, that it's really important to sort of monitor. It's the old saw of what gets measured gets managed. And that's going to be important in here, because if we implement something and just kind of walk away from it, it's sort of going to return back to the mean and return back to areas of concentrated impact. So we think it's important to continuously measure the impacts and try to manage it from that. And if that means increasing the number of meters, restricting the time limits, other draconian steps, we should evaluate those kind of on an ongoing basis. So it's not a one-stop solution, I don't think, by any means. Whatever alternatives we come up with, we kind of need to discuss, and a good part of this area is in the coastal zone with the California Coastal Commission as well. So I think I just wanted to mention that. So these were our initial recommendations, and again, we kind of laid out a test area to try out some of the metered parking and to see if it made sense to have paid parking along Coast Highway, and maybe again some of the time restrictions or residential permits in this northwest area through there, and looking at the rest of the area to see if it makes sense to have some permit parking. And again, I think there's another alternative in here that lays out the definitions for these a little bit better. But this is kind of the area that we thought it'd be good to have a pilot program at. The other alternatives that we have were, looking at maximizing efficiency without exclusive parking rights for residents. So not necessarily establishing some sort of, residential zone necessarily, but kind of continuing to share the area on I guess, a first-come, first-served basis, and charging for parking on residential streets. So again, make it so that there's available parking, but there is a fee that comes along with that. Alternative 3 is parking management, just using time limits. So kind of manage the area using time limits without necessarily the residential parking permits and no meters or anything like that. So those are the 3 alternatives we looked at. Again, our initial recommendation was alternative 1. When we came to the steering committee to talk about this, we kind of had some back and forths, and the community's test program, what they kind of recommended, what they kind of pulled out from our recommended alternatives and some of their own initiatives were to look at the Coast Highway and make it subject to highly enforced 2-hour time limits along the entire length. So again, not necessarily taking our metered one, but in alternative 2 or alternative 3, where we have 2-hour time limits. Again, there's currently 1-hour time limits there, making it 2-hour time limits, but increasing enforcement. They also suggested that with that 1 block into the residential areas on the south side of Coast Highway, from Avocado to Heliotrope, residents should receive up to 3 residential parking permits, good for 1 year during their test program initiative. And again, if this would become permanent, it would be required that the residents demonstrate that the parking is functional.
What does highly enforcing 2 hours get you versus not highly enforcing a 1-hour limit?
First, let me clarify something. This is a misnomer, calling it a community alternative recommendation. This was a recommendation that staff and I came up with, frankly. And when we presented it to the community, the community didn't necessarily embrace it. We got one response was, well, you just paid these people who are experts some money to come up with a plan. Their plan says you should do metered parking. Why did you throw that out? And when we went to a more business-oriented community session, a number of the businesses also supported the idea of meters. The reason they liked the meters was because different businesses have such different needs. One business, 15 minutes, and the customer's in and out. Another could be 2 or 3 hours if you're doing the whole spa thing. So they thought that that was a great idea. As far as the enforcement, parking enforcement was quite clear. There's not going to be regular, great parking enforcement. You can go in for a period of time and do sort of a shock and awe that you're there every hour and you're ticketing like mad, but then you have to go to the rest of the city because we just don't have that kind of staff. We'd have to be down taking care of the peninsula and everything. So while I think the genesis of this is we were really nervous about just suddenly putting in a bunch of meters, not knowing how they would work. But I did want to clarify that this wasn't something that we had this huge community upswelling support for. The main community support we had was the residents right in that one area, which is our pilot program, are very frustrated with a lot of business parking, particularly late night stuff from the restaurants, and they would like some kind of relief from that. But as to how it was, they didn't seem to care, just so they could have some relief. So I just wanted to say this is not necessarily.
So
Well,
Nancy,
did you get any feedback on the permit, like were they in favor of a permit?
Most of the people that live there would think a permit would be great, not necessarily for employees, but for the residents. It was clear that, well, I shouldn't say that. If they lived in that first block, now the people who live beyond the block, they were saying, why? Because it's just going to push the problem down to us. And there was a number of people just said, hey, it's worked this far, why don't you just leave it alone? So there was a mixed response.
So Nancy, what drove you then to put together this so-called community alternative? I mean, what was it that drove you to
Well, I think that
suggest
when
this alternative?
we were talking about it, it just seemed so dramatic, and this was months ago. This was before we presented this second alternative. It seemed so dramatic to go and just put meters in. I mean, it's an expense. And what kind of meters and that. And then the whole necessity, if you put meters in, do you put meters for that first block, or do you go into a different kind of program and everything? And so it seemed like, would it work if we, what would be the least time-consuming and money-consuming way that we could at least test some of these things? And so that's what we came up with. But as I say, it was really basically a couple of staff and I sitting down, so I cannot claim that it's a community program.
On the permit parking, is there in order to get a permit, is there any way that we can ascertain whether or not their garages are open for parking? Is there some sort of test that?
That was one of the things that if we did this the first year, I mean, for the test period, you could get a permit. But if we made it a permanent program, if you wanted to get a permit, you had to show that your garage could park the necessary number of cars. Of course, it will be like everything else. I mean, test time comes, the garage is empty, and a week later it's all filled. But one thing we did learn, which is sort of interesting, and I don't know if it occurs in other areas, is that in some of the areas right behind that first block, businesses are renting people's garages because it's cheaper to rent the garage for storage than to pay for the extra business square footage. So the residents are going, hey, I'll park my car on the street and get $500 a month or something. So that was another twist.
Need to leave it like it is.
Yeah, and I guess just following through with the rest of these, the third bullet kind of talks about, again, that lot between Carnation and Dahlia, making that more available. There was some concern in the community about the number of employees being impacted, and that some of the burden of this change is impacting employees more than other folks in the area.
How would you know employees are parking there? Would they have to get some kind of a sticker or something?
I mean, they could. I mean, I drove through there again today, and I think there were 4 cars in that lot. 3 of them had loophole stickers, and 1 was in the ADA space. So I guess it's likely that most of those were employees, but I think for the most part, we see that as the people that would want to park there. Since it's not heavily used now, the residents, since they did prohibit overnight parking in that lot, would not likely store their vehicles there just in the daytime. So I think the idea behind some of this is that if you create it to make it available during the daytime, the employees are the most likely
So
to
just by
park.
covering them up and the fact that the residents wouldn't park there overnight, that's enough of an incentive for the employees to park there?
I think so.
The issue there was we had some really eager people. I mean, this one man took his kids out and did a survey of all the businesses in the area, and he found there were in that area something like 800 employees. And so we have I don't know what the parking lot holds, but it doesn't hold anything close to 800. So that even if you have something, you're still going to have to find a lot of just, if you have businesses, you're going to have to find employee parking on the residential streets. Just no way getting around it. I think that there is some complaint about parking during the day, but the main complaint is the restaurants. And if we could handle the restaurant employees, perhaps, and get them so they weren't slamming their doors at 1 in the morning when they're leaving, perhaps that would help. But we cannot possibly have a program where employees can't park on the street, I don't think, because we just have way too many employees.
Yeah, and I think it's like many things, there's got to be some sort of an outlet for them, so we don't have to, I mean, I think the employees should be accommodated through the land use and through the current code to have available parking on site. And again, it's hard to compare the number of employees that a business has with the number of spaces and their shifts and everything else. But our assumption is that there's adequate parking on many of these businesses to house their employees, but not necessarily making it available for them because they do want their customers to have those spaces as well.
And I think a big issue has been, and I've heard complaints from businesses, that the employees park on the Coast Highway, and that they just move their cars when they have to. But then, so the customers, the prime parking, which is where you want your customers, is not available because employees are using it. So that would be something we would want to try to rearrange, so that prime parking is available for the customers and everybody else we deal with somehow.
Can't employers sort of have some guidelines for their employees? I don't know. I mean, that would seem to be the straightforward way to regulate it.
In terms of where they park? Yeah, and I know we talked to some of the specifically restaurant owners there, and they say that they have sort of accumulated or leased out parking spaces for their employees. I think they, kind of cobbled together, close to 100 spaces in this one area, that they ask their employees to park at. But I think, as they're driving from their place of work to that spot, they see a place on street, and they just kind of slip in there rather than go the extra block or 2 or 3 or whatever it was. And so it's hard to manage and hard to enforce. I think you can ask their employee where they parked when they come in, and hopefully they would say in the employee lot that you provided for me, but it's not always the case, is what they found out. Because I think, he ended up doing a couple counts and seeing in these spaces where he thought he'd see 20 or 30 cars, there were, again, 4 or 5.
Yeah, and it's you got a really great employee and they sort of bend the rules on where they park. Your recourse is to fire that employee. Not going to happen. So, employer enforcement of employee parking is a pretty hard thing, it seems to me, to get done. Beyond that, this issue of highly, quote-unquote, highly enforced, the reaction that I get sometimes from people is, well, that's simple. You're going to be issuing more tickets. You can just hire more parking enforcement people, and it'll all pay for themselves. The city will even make more money. So what's your reaction to that, Mark?
It's certainly possible. Again, it's a trade-off, and typically what we find, and why we're sort of reluctant to even start down this road with the limits, is that it's difficult to enforce, and that it's not very, like you say, cost-effective to do that on the time limit basis. You have to be very strict with it. And again, it creates many more headaches. I mean, you're kind of penalizing the people that you're trying to accommodate oftentimes. And we see that in residential areas as well, that the people that are the most impacted from residential parking permits end up being the residents because they have two permits, but somebody comes to visit them without one, they get ticketed or towed or whatever happens. So you certainly, in an area with high utilization or high density, can generate enough tickets to offset a good portion of that expense. You do create some ill will, I think, which again is a delicate act in a commercial district or an area that relies on visitors for its growth.
So overall, by virtue of your recommendation, you're suggesting that high enforcement is really not the best way to go. That a self-regulating pricing mechanism is the way to go.
That's what we prefer. I mean, enforcement's got to be part of that. And again, we understand the challenges of having enforcement in the area. Highly enforced isn't necessarily my term. But I think what we're trying to get at here is that, this separates, just the sort of enforced, as, catch as catch can, 1 hour time limits that are there now, and then make this more real, I think, if I'm engaging this correctly, Councilman Gardner, that, the highly enforced makes that 2 hours very strict, whereas right now, the 1 hour is a little more laissez-faire.
Right, it makes it very strict while that traffic enforcement person is there. A question, because we had talked, to go back to what you had recommended as far as metered parking, and I think everybody can understand the reluctance to just say, okay, we're going to meter from Avocado to Poppy, and oops, a year later, not working, and we spent all that money. If we do a test program where we did meter just a certain segment, do you think that would still give us a fairly good idea of the effectiveness?
It'll give you an idea.
I mean, obviously, there'll still be some trickle, but...
Right, and I think that's what happens. I mean, I think, again, if we do this test area from, say, Avocado to, to Dahlia or Heliotrope or whatever we want to do, and you say you meter that area, then, you kind of push it down to Jasmine or other areas. And, will that change if we start to enforce that? And does that then push the parking issue that we've now created into areas that don't have a parking issue? And so we try to balance that and say, well, what's the most effective? Can we sort of graduate this out into some concentric rings where the problem, sort of self-corrects and self-mitigates? And so that's what we try to do by saying, if I think the problem now with the lot on 4th Street between Carnation and Dahlia is that you have to park further from your destination and you have to pay for that inconvenience. And so what we try to do with the metered parking is say, this is the best parking. It should also have a cost that reflects that quality. So let's charge for that, and the less good parking, we try to make less expensive. So if that's going to be less expensive in transaction cost by having to move your car in an hour or 2 hours, or in terms of free parking or whatever it is, well, that's how we try to do it, is take the areas of highest concentration, assign a value to that, either in time or money, and then sort of radiate out from there in terms of convenience.
So your goal is not to increase the turnover then on Coast Highway?
The goal
It's to price it, because when I look at this map, there's 28 block faces in your study area on Coast Highway, and out of those 28 blocks, there's only 3 that are 90% or greater.
Yeah.
So the other ones fall into your magic formula of meeting the turnover.
Yeah, I think our goal is always to have occupancy below 85%. And so how we do that, it has a variety of things. Like I said, different times of day, you're going to have different intensity and different demand in that area. And so we want to meter it or price it or restrict it so that we can achieve a sufficient occupancy level, not necessarily a revenue number or a target $1 an hour, $2 an hour number. Those might be the numbers that you get with 80% occupancy, but can we smooth that out and so that throughout the day that we have at least 15% of the spaces available, or about a space per block is our ideal.
One of the
in a
things
long
that
area, it's hard.
One of the things we talked also about is using a different kind of meter. I was just up in Glendale, and that's just so easy to use. You can use your credit card, and it's easy to add time on and that sort of thing. So it wouldn't have to be necessarily the same old one for every parking space.
Or pay kiosks
Right.
located at each corner.
Yeah, and again, strategically place that so people don't have to walk more than whatever it's going to be, 50 or 80 feet, and make it as convenient as possible. And then that's like what we like to see is some flexibility in the system, so that as we've talked in other areas, that maybe on days on Sundays or in the evenings where it's not as busy, or in the mornings you don't necessarily make it the same price as you do during the peak dinner rush. So you try to again spread that demand out a little bit. And kind of encourage people to park where you want them rather than where they think it's the easiest. And a lot of it's expectation. When you go to Fashion Island, you never park within 100 feet of your destination, or rarely do. But people come to expect that. In Corona Del Mar, it's kind of a quaint area, and you always want to park within 50 feet of your destination. Again, I was down there this afternoon having coffee, and I didn't want to, drive further than I needed to. So, it's, again, managing our expectations in this area and making sure that people know that they can park there, and if it's convenient, they're willing to pay for it. And if it's free, they might be a bit more inconvenienced. And that's kind of our goal. I guess our goal is not inconvenience, but it is to reward the convenience.
Did you want to take some public comment and then?
Well, yeah, I saw Bernie was out there. I'm sure he had something to say.
Bernie Svalstad, Chairman of the Business Improvement District for Corona Del Mar, and on the Board of Directors of the Corona Del Mar Chamber. Nancy, I think, summarized most of it real well. We've had, 5-10 meetings out there from different times over the past couple of years, and this is kind of the summary. We went around and gave every business in that area notification before we held this last meeting. And it's a little bit surprising that Nancy said that actually, although there's expense, ratio involved in whether you want to do that to start with on a test program, but they actually were surprisingly a little interested in meters, right? And which kind of floored me and I think Nancy. So I think there is a need. Most of these are restaurants, so I think that's the idea of the 2-hour because, it's pretty hard to get into. These are all pretty much sit-down restaurants. They're not fast food to get in and out within an hour. So I think that's one of the reasons. There are problems. We had some residential people there. There are problems, parking in the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. So this seemed to be pretty much a majority. I don't think there's anybody there, Nancy, that objected to this from the business community that I can remember this last test program.
I think the only concern about the metered parking was not from the business community, was residents in terms of the impact if you didn't do something for that first block or two.
Right. So I think there is a need. There is a proposal possibly for some interesting parking situation would be 2-3 years down the line on this same city property that may be coming into you in the next, 6 months, 3 months, who knows. But anyway, that's a long ways off. But I think Nancy summarized it, and this gentleman summarized it. We've had many, many meetings, and it's just something that I think would be worth a test. I don't know the cost ratio analysis that I don't know if you come up with that yet or not, but you put in meters, it's one thing. If it didn't work, where do you want to put the meters? I'm sure there's somewhere in the city that you could move the meters to if you had to. If you wanted to start out just on this basis and try that, it'd be pretty simple. The worst case, least case analysis, I think would be good to try to, because I don't think you get that much income. Nancy has the figures somewhere on that city property there at Dahlia, and so I think that would be a real simple, very minimal partial situation to help some of the employee parking there. So that's about it.
Did you consider, like the problem area seems to be from, right now anyway, from Avocado to Dahlia, like doing parking meters there and for the test program and then doing the rest of these things?
Well, we talked about all of them. I think Nancy brought up the point, I guess, because she's more involved with the residential people. But I think if you did that, then I think, Nancy, they wanted some protection. Isn't that the situation? Somehow it's kind of a quid pro quo type of thing on the residences. So.
I think it's really important. I know, Mike, in your area, you're talking about a lot of this, that if we do consider permit parking, that we do very much do a pilot program, because I think that Mark's right, that it sounds great. Oh, terrific, I'm always going to have that parking place. But, I mean, it'd be fine for me. I never have anybody over. I don't have parties, so I wouldn't have to worry about that. But for the people who are social, all of a sudden Aunt Minnie comes in, or they're having a party, and the 2 hours is up, and nobody has a permit, and oops. So there could be some downsides to it that we would want to see. And also, as I said, we want to see if that first block is permitted, what happens to the second block? Does it just become, we just move the problem? So there are a bunch of issues.
I think it would be important, very important, probably if this is put into effect, that we have this PBD, Parking District Board, so that they could tweak it and work on it without coming back from council and going through a hellacious type of program to be able to tweak it during the period. I think that would be important to have a temporary PDV type of thing to help self-regulate it, because if you saw some of these problems, you could move it around and make some changes that might make it better. So I think that would be important to institute at the same time. And this has to go through the Coastal Commission, I guess. I don't know what the time period on that is, but and the timing on doing that.
I guess from my perspective, I'm very much in favor of self-regulating pricing mechanisms on this kind of thing. I really am. I mean, especially now when we're looking at other budgetary issues with the city and trying to rely upon an enforcement solution that involves city staff, I just don't think that's the best way to go. So from where I sit, I kind of like the Walker parking recommendation applied on a pilot basis in that most congested area with the permits. What I guess I would like to see is a specific proposal then to do that, including an estimate of costs so that we know what we're rolling the dice on in case we just think it's a terrible idea after a year or two. And I also like this parking benefit district, if we can, without going to a great deal of effort and expense, set something up for the governance of it. So I kind of like the parking recommendation, the Walker parking recommendation, on a pilot basis, but not for the full length of Coast Highway. Just
So you're talking Avocado to Dahlia?
or maybe another street or so down, just to sort of allow for this trickle effect to self-mitigate, if you will, because you could always charge a lower parking rate on the next street down from Dahlia to try and, provide that buffering, that self-buffering effect. But I'd leave that up to the experts to decide what's the right section.
I'm a little confused. I thought I heard Nancy say that if Aunt Bessie was visiting and stayed longer than 2 hours, she might, and she doesn't have a permit, that she could get a ticket. I thought that everybody within that first block was going to have a permit.
You're right, I misspoke.
Okay, now that really bothers me, because what you've done is you've taken the parking that most customers are looking to use and said, nope, you can't park there anymore. So the customers
No,
definitely
that's
go
not-
2 blocks down.
I didn't misspeak. There would be time limits. If you had a permit, there was no time limit, so you could stay all day long and all night long. But if you didn't have the permit, then there would be, that was, I think, the way we had looked at it. Then you would have, say, a 2-hour time limit, so you could be a customer and get out. But you couldn't be an employee, probably, because you'd have to go move your car or just hope you didn't get a ticket.
But under the Walker proposal, that first block down would be metered, and a permit system, so that the residents could park there all day long without having to feed the meter, but the meters would provide for the turnover and prevent some employee parking in that area as well. Is that right, Mark? Is that what you were?
Yeah, that's typically what we would suggest. I mean, we're kind of batting around a sort of a variety of our alternatives here.
Yeah, I think that was the one that the residents, we didn't really push that, and I think the residents, I would want to go back again as far as meters in a residential neighborhood, just to get a sense of reaction, because as I say, that was sort of skimmed over. We were more talking about really focusing on permits and that sort of thing, rather than moving the meters a block in.
Yeah, and I think, when we look at it too, there's some areas that as you kind of go a half block or a block in, are more commercially oriented, and I think that's kind of the area that we were thinking would have meters, and and also there's typically some behind the business parking there, so if maybe on that street there's also meters. I think that's more conceptually what we were talking about in that area, not necessarily putting in front of somebody's mailbox. But I suppose, like you said, kind of anything's on the table. And if it is beneficial, we could certainly do it. And there's plenty of municipalities out there that do that.
Well, if you go in a block in, wherever there's residences, you're only affecting a half a block of residences. And a lot of the blocks, there's actually commercial that goes back all the way to the first street.
Right. Yeah. Then that's kind of what
So
we're seeing.
I don't know if you go a block in, how many residences you'd actually affect. I mean, you could, like you said, you could probably delete the residences out of that and not have a big effect on what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think even when we're saying, a block in, maybe it's not that sort of a tight of definition, that it is sort of in these commercial areas that sometimes go a half block or a block in, and you meter around that. But, I don't know. I think it's going to be up to council to decide the specific area where we put the meters. I do think, though, the more areas you meter, the higher the likelihood that you are going to push the problem into some of the residential areas.
Well, I think that if we get sense from the council that we should at least move forward, we can start to fine-tune this and come back with a specific program. And if I feel the need that we need to get a little more feedback, we can always have a meeting and get that reaction.
Mayor Pro Tem Curry?
I guess my observation is that these are a lot of solutions somewhat in search of a problem. But I really think that what we have to do is get very specific, as was suggested by Mike and Nancy, and then go back to the community and get some feedback. I think parking meters are a lot more popular conceptually than they are in actual implementation when you start talking about specific neighborhoods. And I also, as you look at the capacity issues, I mean, this is a fairly concentrated problem in specific parts of Corona Del Mar. And so I think you really have to tailor a solution with the businesses and residences on those specific streets to come up with something that's going to be workable and acceptable. And I think Nancy's solution of going back and getting more community feedback when you've got something very specific in hand is the right way to go.
Yeah.
Steve?
What about, if you'd come over a second, because it always concerns me now you've created a kind of, with this permit, a parking zone that's just for the use of those residents who live in front of those homes. But, I mean, I park in my neighborhood sometimes on the street, and I don't just park in my block, I park the next block up. What about expanding the permit zone for the first couple of blocks so that people that maybe live, because a lot of it's going to get pushed in.
Right.
I think it will. I think that an employee, if you have 800 employees in search of parking, and they got to be there for 8 hours, they're not looking to feed the meter. They're just going to walk, learn that the next block up is open and start taking up parking down there, which those, I think that might help some of those residents there. I mean, personally, I kind of agree a little bit more with Keith about this, is that, yeah, you show, there's certain specific areas that certainly are impacted, but, for the whole strip there, I wonder whether this is really,
Right, and kind of like the initial maps kind of show that, overall, like when you're looking system-wide, that maybe there's not a huge problem. We did have some community members, some business owners and some residents address the areas in that sort of northwest portion. Specifically, I think the restaurants generating a lot of traffic, and so we tried to address that. Within that, our recommendation was to have sort of that residential buffer area go in a couple blocks, at least in the test program or the pilot program, so that we can see how that is. And it's not necessarily, like Nancy said, limited to only residents, but certainly to the people that are going to stay there all day, we would like to limit that to only residents. I mean, there is that idea that in a pilot program or a test program that perhaps you're giving somebody 3 residential parking permits and creating some sort of entitlement for them to have those spaces. We also, came to the realization that, that 3 residential permits is very generous, especially when the street frontage on many of those properties is less than the 60 feet that would be required for those parking spaces. So, we're creating an entitlement that's greater than the actual physical property. So we understand that that's a bit of an issue. Again, that was like Councilman Gardner said, that they came up with this, and
where did the number 3 come from? I mean, actually, I'd probably like to see that reduced down to a couple probably per house.
Yeah, to me, that would be part of what staff needs to analyze and
Yeah,
recommend
and one of the
coming
ideas
back.
was that, you know, one is minimal, two is, and then by three or, if you wanted 3 or 4, you'd be starting to pay for them too, so that it would more than cover.
Well, at that point, you can just probably buy a city permit and park wherever you want.
I mean, that's what we would hope to see is that, obviously, the first order of magnitude is that residents park in their garages. If that doesn't work, maybe they can park, you know, a car on the street with a residential permit, and have that, you know, charged at, you know, we would like to see it at a market rate, but if it's just to cover administrative costs, then that's acceptable. And so each successive permit beyond that, they have to charge a little bit more, so that there is some incentive for them not to store all their vehicles on the street. And that's our baseline recommendation is, you know, not necessarily saying you can't have these cars, but, you know, at least contribute to the cost of storing them on the street if you're going
You should make the permit equal to the cost that these commercial properties are paying to rent their garages.
Yeah, I mean,
There's an arbitrage right there
well,
somewhere.
I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing, as Councilman Gardner said, that you know, there are some people that have done that sort of calculus and decided that you know, parking is more valuable for some of the commercial properties to use.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, those commercial spaces are going for $3, $4, $5 a square foot when you can rent a garage for $500 for, you know, $1 a square foot, maybe.
One of the things I'm concerned about that I just got to, is parking meters on Coast Highway, pretty well laid out. We know those spaces. But as you start getting into the residential areas, if we actually put in meters, hard piped meters, you're going to lose spaces. And so I think that you really need to consider for those areas the program where you have stickers or that you pull off and use so that you don't reduce the number of spaces, because you can, residents with smaller cars will work it out to where they can park 3 cars in the space of 2 that would be set up for a metered space. So I don't think you want to do that either. So I think.
Well, if you have the kiosks, doesn't that take away that problem? If you have the kiosk.
You do a kiosk-type arrangement to where you don't specifically stripe out the spaces in the residential areas. You probably still need to do that in Coast Highway because you want to have more space to get the people in and out as far as traffic is concerned.
And it eliminates an ugly parking meter in front of your house, too. So the pay kiosk has to be the way to go for the residential.
Yeah, I think so. As Councilman Webb says, I mean, you do restrict a lot, 'cause I think you need 22 feet probably at least on curb.
Right, on Coast Highway. The other thing is what Nancy had originally mentioned. If you're going to have permit areas, you still need to allow people to park within the 2-hour time limit, so that we're allowing some other parking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the important thing, is that there should always be some sort of accommodation for everybody. And even within that, the 2-hour time limit, the only thing that makes me nervous about 2-hour time limits, and we've done this in a lot of cities, is, you know, there's sort of that notorious 2-hour shuffle, as we call it, where employees all evacuate every 2 hours and move their car.
We have a precedent up around Newport Harbor High School.
Yeah. So you know, within that, there is some fine tuning that goes on. So
To be clear, what my suggestion was did not include the 2-hour time limit idea. It was metered, self-regulating pricing mechanism as opposed to having 2-hour time. I'm talking about in the pilot area, in the pilot demonstration area. You wouldn't have 2-hour time limits. You would just have, it would just be metered using kiosks. And then people would regulate themselves on how much time they want to spend in a particular space. Those kiosks have another advantage in that they're programmable, and you can readily change. They're also easily Wi-Fi communicatable. So there's lots of advantages to those kiosks.
Are you suggesting that you wouldn't have any permitting along with that?
Oh, yes. The Walker recommendation included permitting on the residential streets. You would also have metered cost on those residential streets. And what I would like to see is a proposal that shows all of that in a cohesive proposal that we could all have a look at, including what the ballpark cost of that is, so that in case we don't like it, we know what we're throwing away to get rid of it. So.
okay.
I mean, I'm just trying to clarify things, is that,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't have a problem with your recommendation. I tend to agree with Councilman Rosansky and Curry that we should be focusing on an area, in the pilot areas. Obviously, it, and from my experience in Corona Del Mar, that area and down by Albertsons are really the two problem areas. Other than that, irrespective of the statistics in terms of parking shortages, I don't know that I really see that much of a parking shortage in actual use in those areas, but certainly down there from Avocado to Dahlia, and that area is really one of our big problem areas. But, you know, I think your suggestion that you go back and talk to the community is important too, because particularly if we get into any kind of kiosks or things like that, I know that Seal Beach a number of years ago went out and was going to put meters on their main street and went out and bought all the meters, and before they had people's buy-in to it, and they never got installed and got sold at 50 cents on the dollar.
That's what we want to, and then we'd had the same problem down in Balboa, didn't we? Put in one kind of meter and then decided that.
That was the program where we were looking at the detector in the street that would indicate when their time was up that they'd have to leave.
Okay.
They didn't work very well.
Any other comments? Because we're got to get moving on with the agenda here. Okay, any other public comments? Okay, does staff feel they have enough direction out of what we said?
We believe so, yes, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, next item is the subdivision code.
Mr. Lipo is going to present this.
This right here shows.
Mayor and council members, Mr. Lipo is going to give you a little introduction to this, and we've got staff members here who are going to follow up with the details. You recall back in August, we came to with a study session on proposed changes we wanted to make to Title 19, largely to simplify it and make the process easier for applicants. At that time, if you remember, the focus came to the lot line adjustments that allowed reorientation of frontages on corner lots. There were a lot of questions on that, and particularly you wanted to see the application in other areas of the city. We were focusing mostly on the peninsula because that's where the most recent cases have occurred. So we've had three staff people here, Jay Garcia, Dan Campagnolo, and McConna Nova, who've done a lot of research and a lot of work on this, and hopefully you've got your hard copies of the PowerPoint, and we have supplemented those with some additional photographs and images for you. So we're hoping this answers the questions that you raised back in August that we didn't have details for you on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay Garcia. We've got, I'm sorry.
Okay, you mentioned in your summary, you're proposing to delete and replace all of those various different numbers. Now, if we go ahead and do that, are we putting in this lot line adjustment? Is that one of those?
The lot line adjustment is a provision that would be added.
Okay, which
in the
number is
revised
that
ordinance.
of these 19s?
the problem is, Dave, at least in my copy, the proposed ordinance changes weren't included, and I didn't have my old notes.
Oh.
But my understanding was
I'm
from
sorry.
your cover memo is that what you're essentially doing is re-proposing the same thing that was proposed in August.
That is correct, and we will certainly give you the strike-through and underlined version, depending upon what direction you give tonight. We're not asking you to take any action on the other changes. We do have a two-part presentation tonight. The first one focuses on the corner lot line orientation. The second part is a summary of the changes, and I apologize, we didn't give that to you because we thought most of the time it would probably be spent on the corner lot, but we do have a summary of the other changes.
I just didn't want to approve that accidentally because I didn't know what the number was.
Oh, I'm sorry, no, we would bring that back to you. We want you to be very clear, because remember, there are council policies that are called into question and general plan and coastal land use policies that are also in question based on just the corner lot. So that's where the focus is tonight. With that, I'll turn it over to Jay Garcia, who's going to give you the overview.
Good evening. As Mr. Lipo indicated, we are going to address mainly the section right now with the reverse corner frontages and the change of reorienting lots. Okay, so potential impacts of reorienting parcels in the city is what we're going to be dealing with. We're going to have the introduction. We're going to discuss setback and visual impact, vehicle access issues, the impact of fence walls and structures as applied by the regular zoning code, and changes or effects of the buildable area, and utility connections. This is a standard lot with the standard lot configuration with the lots here running east and west. And we've taken a worst-case scenario looking at a small lot of 30 by 70. So you have 3 lots which front on the left front street and the other side street and alley. The standard setbacks that would apply here, we haven't taken into account that the district maps may have setbacks which are less or smaller, especially on front yards. You can see that you would have a standard 20-foot front yard, 5-foot alley setbacks which have to be clear of obstructions, and 3-foot side yards. The general access for vehicular access is from the alley in all those cases. And if we reorient the lots, Lot A and B now become reoriented to the frontage street, and Lot C now becomes a key lot. Lot A would be considered the reverse frontage lot. And you'll notice that Lot B now has the alley as a side yard, and in this particular case, the alley is a 10-foot alley.
Where were the garages?
We're
Oh,
going
all
to
right.
get to that section in a moment. Okay. So the setback and visual impact first, looking at the reorientation. The reverse corner, Lot A, because of code requirements, you'll see this notch out here, which is a continuation of the front yard setback of Lot C, which comes back 20 feet from the rear corner of that parcel. Lot B, now within Lot A, now they have the front street on Front Street. They have the setback now changes to a 20-foot where previously it was a 3-foot side yard. And Lot B now has the 3-foot as a side yard on the side alley. Lot C remains as.
Wouldn't Lot B have to set back 5 feet from the alley in order to get the cars in and out of the garage?
No. The 2060 of the municipal code only has abutting rear yards where they have a 5-foot clear, unobstructed access. Side yard have no such requirement.
So we could change the requirement in the zoning code if you had a situation like Lot B, that the side yard would be a 5-foot side yard when you're adjacent to an alley or something like that.
You could do that.
Okay,
So that would solve that issue if.
There are a number of
Usually
ways
it doesn't solve the issue because they allow a wall to be constructed at property line on a side yard, unless we prohibited the walls from being constructed.
That might be something you'd look at. I don't know.
That may also depend on the width of the alley. Obviously, if a 10-foot alley, you would need that 5-foot clear in order to provide access.
What's the policy on the notch there on Lot A on the house? You said,
There,
yeah.
that is the required reverse corner frontage, the continuation of the Lot C front yard setback.
Yeah.
Comes back from this corner back 20 feet, and it has to have the same setback as Lot C.
So that's a
now.
20 by 20 foot
Correct.
notch, okay.
And then you have the 10-foot rear yards now, because the default rear yard setbacks for these lots, which have been reoriented, now becomes 10 feet. This is a aerial photo of a existing reverse corner. Here's the reverse corner lot, and this is the key lot, which has the 20-foot setback on Mariners, and this one has the front yard on Santiago. You'll notice in the rear, you can just make out the driveway. There are 2 driveways here side by side. That basically accesses the garage here on this side. There are no alleys in this particular case.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different case, there's no alleys there.
But this is where this shows the corner cutoff and then where the building could now go in that side yard.
Yeah, but it's a whole different situation because it's not an alley. I mean, what
Right,
about-
this is an example of the rear yard corner, the notch.
Okay.
Okay. There and then there's
And this is not a house that was turned, is it?
no.
I mean, it was originally built, the tract was built that way.
Correct.
So there was no expectation of the adjoining property owners of houses being in any particular direction.
This one happens to comply with that rear yard notch. Most of these tracts were done prior to annexation. They were done in the 50s and all done through the county. So they may not have even had that corner notch, but this one just happened to have it.
Again, I guess my point is, though, that this is not something that was torn down and rebuilt. This was just built that way. The whole tract was developed that way.
Correct.
Okay.
It's also a large lot. It's not a 30 by 70 as the
Right.
other example showed. Going back to the 30 by 70 lots, here you can see this is the key lot, which is Lot C, which remained oriented to this street. These are the two reoriented lots. And then this is the notch out. And as discussed previously, the fences and walls in the side yard and rear yard can go right up to the property line. In this particular case, you have a parkway of 10 feet from face of curb to the property line.
And they're not subject to the 3-foot height limitation on front fences?
No. This is an example, again, up on Highland and Estelle. Here's the garage on the key lot, which has the garage is set back because it's a 20-foot front. You can just make out the building's out further than 20 feet because the front yard is on Highland. The next picture. Okay, so that's the reverse frontage lot. Now looking from Estelle, looking towards the intersection, here's the fence. It's out in the side and rear yard. The garage is back here. We have another shot of it that you better see it. So you have the corner, which basically has a fence right on that corner of that property. Vehicular access issues. The general plan policy for curb cuts adopted in July of 2006. General plan policies and the CLUP policies require alley access to parking areas for all new development in areas where alley access exists. The general plan policy also requires new development to minimize curb cuts to protect on-site parking spaces and to close curb cuts to create on-street parking wherever feasible.
Those policies must have been sort of developed to address other conditions, though. I mean, what's sort of the bigger picture with those policies?
Well, again, they were addressed or marked for new development. Both of them were. So non-conforming situations, the question has come up, if you tear down and rebuild, how do you apply these two policies? Should there be an exception to that? The general plan policy doesn't provide a caveat or an out on being able to avoid or get an exception to these. The council policy, L2, which addresses driveway approaches, which was amended in October of 2006, did not take into account the changes to the general plan policies and the CLUP. The L2 policies require that you minimize drive openings to preserve on-street parking, no new curb cuts for residential properties which abut an alley. The policy provides exceptions and a process to approve such.
Can you very briefly describe that?
The exception?
Those exceptions in that process?
The exceptions would deal with if you were doing a R2 construction where you're dividing up to a front and rear building, front and rear unit, you would be able to use a side access a side garage from the side street, and the other building would take access from the alley. So that's one of the ways that it could be done. That's usually what we're seeing with new construction, more in condominiums.
This is just for R2 situations?
Could be multifamily also. Usually you don't have this with...
But not single family?
Not single family, but you could, the way L2 is written, you could apply, take it to the council if denied at the staff level.
For a single family?
For a single family.
Okay.
How long have you worked here, like 25 years? Long time, huh?
Almost 30, yes.
Almost 30, great. In terms of the requests for this kind of switcheroo, how many have you seen in 30 years?
Well, usually we will gain access from the alley with most of the new construction. When we have been dealing with re-subdivisions or parcel maps where they're reorienting or providing parking to a side street for one of the units, we can get away from doing tandem parking. And it's a better marketing for the units if it has a garage with its own access on an alley and on a side street. And I'm not sure, I don't know if Steve Badham can answer if we deal with very many of these.
It's not quite that often. It's mostly the corner lots. And it's my understanding, even on a single-family lot, if you are providing more than the required spaces, you can have that. So if you, let's say you're single family, you're required to have 2 spaces. If you want that extra curb cut on the side street, you could have essentially a third or a fourth
You'd have
garage
to
space.
require above-code off-street parking on your property.
That's correct.
And also, in order to preserve street trees, driveways are not permitted, which would remove a street tree. I don't know that that includes relocation of trees, Mr. Badham?
We generally don't allow folks to take out trees to move their driveways. We're very aggressive in keeping the street trees, so they have to get approval through PB&R Commission if they want to take out a street tree, and if they want to relocate a driveway. And when that quite often does happen, folks want to flip-flop a new house and put the garage on the other side of the property, and it hits a mature tree, and we generally tell them they can't do that.
Thank you. Did I skip one? That's the next one.
I guess I had just one quick question, David Hunt. I think we discussed this before, but if you could just clarify, this policy that requires alley access to parking areas for all new development in areas where alley exists, that's a general plan policy. Does that preclude any exceptions? In other words, does that policy have the same force as zoning code regulation? How do you view that?
I view it as having the same force and effect as a zoning regulation. Your general plan is usually considered a policy document that is not enforceable as regulation per se. But usually it's an aspirational type of document that says something along the lines that the city shall encourage, or where possible we shall do, or things like that. That language is not such. It says require. And when we have directive language in the context of the general plan, we have to treat it as, in fact, regulatory, because the general plan takes precedence over our general regulatory language.
And a tear down and a rebuild is considered to be new development.
I have not analyzed that. Tonight is the first time I heard that analysis and come out. It strikes me as new development, but the circumstances may be different depending upon exactly what's going on and how that happens. So I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know the background of that particular situation, and I haven't looked at that.
The policies do come into play, especially when we have a map involved, because then the maps require that you be consistent with the general plan and the land use element, the general plan, and the zoning. So if you're going to propose a parcel map for condos, now in order to provide the site access, there's no way to do it because you can't get the map because of these policies. So the policies need an out or ability to provide an exception if that's what we want to do.
Having been ZA, when there was an inconsistency between zoning and general plan, how'd you rule?
Unfortunately, most of the maps we did in 05 and 06, they were trying to beat some of the other code changes that we were making. They were all alley access. Some of the condo conversions for existing may have had side yard garages already, so they had non-conforming access. So we would approve those because it was consistent with the general plan when the buildings were originally built.
Because I always thought there was a lot of administration here that was done by exception. That was kind of our...
Not with the ZA on new construction. And usually for maps, we were only dealing with the map and not the building itself.
Let's move forward and see the exhibits.
Okay. This exhibit shows a side access from a street for Lot A and basically accessing the garage from the street typically a two-car garage, which would be required. The code only requires one covered space, so, but they would need at least 19 feet of clearance in front of the garage to provide the second. So they could do tandem, and the code would allow that. Or they could move the garage forward, well, they would need a mod to move forward, but they could provide the other parking in this area. This is a,
By doing that, you effectively take away the effect of, or at least partially, of removing the building from that space, right? Because now you have ostensibly you're going to have cars, as we've found out in the last discussion.
correct. You would lose an on-street parking space, and you would lose building footprint on the ground floor.
Yeah, but I'm talking about Lot C is relying on, okay, now you've created this notch, I'm assuming for some type of a view or up the street, but cars will be parking there anyway, so you probably have lost some of your view.
Or also fences and walls could also be in that corner.
That's
In
true.
the,
Go ahead, go ahead.
in the example, though, that lot is only 30 feet wide, and so that you really only have a 10-foot parking area behind the garage.
Correct.
Or actually, you have less than that. You have a 7-foot space behind the garage.
Well, no, because he's
You're talking
saying
about here?
it has to be 20 feet clear, right?
Well,
This is 20 feet back.
well,
this is 10 feet
that means
from-
you can't have the garage where his car is then.
Yeah, he can have a carport, is what you're saying, right? So part of his car is going to be, 10 feet of his car is going to be in the, well, actually not even, because there's a setback on the other side, right?
Right. You'll need a mod in order to put the garage here because you only have 20 feet to work with. So yes, you have
Well, this is
27
getting
feet
better and better.
of backup from setback line to the next setback line.
So Lot B and Lot C still take theirs from the alley,
Yes, B and C, yes.
but C takes it from the side street, so A takes it from the side street, overturning the general plan policy, and it also doesn't provide adequate parking without a modification? Is that what I just heard?
Yes.
Oh.
On a 30-foot wide lot.
Parking place.
This is a map on Peninsula Point. This is Seville. And this map actually had two reverse corner lots on the street ends at Balboa. And then these were the key lots. You'll see that the access to these lots, which are on Seville, have their access from Seville, from the street. And all the others, including the reverse frontage lot, in this case, well, I'm sorry, the back lot and the alleys, the key lot and beyond, that provide access from the alley.
And was this a tear down and reconstruction that was permitted?
This map was done in 1929.
Oh, so it was originally
It's
constructed?
originally designed this way, yes. In order to provide vehicle access from the alley to Lot A, would require that you create an easement and access from the alley across the back of Lot B to Lot A, and in order to do that, you're going to lose this 120 square foot of footprint because the pavement here is shown in gray. In order to access this, you're going to lose more ground floor construction. Fences and walls, again, we talked about this is now a side yard, a 3-foot side yard, so a fence could be built on the alley setback.
Is there any safety element? I mean, there's some reason why we have 5 feet from the alley. I would assume it helps the fire trucks and everything else. And suddenly we have 3 feet and it could be a wall. That's a huge difference.
It is a big difference. But it's the same situation you have on the existing, this type of situation now. If you have a 10-foot alley, this one, you have the same thing. You
Yeah,
have
but
3-foot
those alleys are
setback.
20 feet, though, I think.
Yeah,
We
and
do
that
have,
was-
we do have some in the central portion of the peninsula where people have built them on the side yard, and if the lot across from the side yard does not set their garage face back an additional 5 feet, they only have 15 feet to get in and out of their garages, and therefore they don't use the garages because it's too difficult to get in and out.
Right. You see that on the ocean front as well.
Yeah.
There's walls there that effectively go to the property line and creates a very difficult situation for the other homeowners.
Are we going to, at some point in this, get to the reason why we want to do this? Because I seem to be missing that in this discussion so far.
This shows where the 5-foot setback was when the lots were oriented the other direction. and basically the wall location and the access point down here. Now the access for the lots across the alley, in order to get across, in and out of their garages, it's diminished by the location of this fencing wall, which now is 5 feet closer to the alley than previous required. Here at this section here, in the front yard setback, it's a 3-foot wall. So the 3-foot wall is going to have the same effect as a 6-foot wall because it's going to affect your backup. So a vehicle coming out of the garage, you've got 15 feet of backup now, which means you probably need a 2 or 3 point turn in order to get in and out of the garage. At the location where you have a 6-foot wall, again, you're going to have the same issue. You got 15 feet of backup, which means a multi-point turn to get in and out of the garage. This is an example of a side yard property. This is on Balboa Island, where this fence is on the property line, and you have the garages across the alley, which have a 5-foot and then 10-foot. So they have a reduced backup. And then this was the original backup, so you have your 10-foot alley, and then your 5-foot, so you have 20 feet of backup. In most cases, depending on the vehicle, you should be able to back in and out without having to do a multi-point turn.
Probably not the other Hummer.
You turn on a dime. This is an example of it, basically your standard 10-foot alley with, it actually might be a 14-foot alley with, I'm sorry?
No, those are 10-foot alleys.
10-foot alley, West Newport. So you have a 5-foot setback on both sides, and this, you have what has been termed before as a canyon effect. In this case, most of the buildings are single story, but if you have 2-story buildings, then you basically have that canyon effect. The effect on the buildable area, this was the original configuration, where you had about 1,080 of buildable area on this 30 by 70. By reorienting the lots, you've lost 36% of your buildable on Lot A and 20% on Lot B, which means you're going to have a smaller house on either one. Again, that doesn't take into account what you're going to have to do in order to access the garage or provide a garage in this back area. Utility impacts. This is an example of lots that were reoriented on Bayside and Carnation. There is a private utility easement that runs across the back of lots A and B to service Lot C. And during construction, one of these buildings severed the utilities, and Lot C was without power. I'm not sure how long that was, but somebody didn't check on that. And you can see the sewer and water service, in this case, runs from the alley. That private utility easement has to accommodate also the water and sewer connections, unless you can try to connect down below. But here you have more public property down here that you have to cross in order to get to one. This is that same property as viewed from Bayside. You have that alley that terminates up here, and then the houses that come down. These are the second
That house
unit.
was empty, but they wanted to move back in, and no power. It was all severed. They had to come up, but Steve was very good on that. He really helped us with that one.
I have some examples of some areas on the peninsula and some of the maps that were done. This list shows most of the maps that were done on the central level are in 1905, 6, 8, and 1904. This one probably shows the best indicator of what happened on East Newport. These parcels here in yellow, look kind of greenish, are reoriented lots that currently exist. The lots typically ran east and west on the block ends, and they'd be reoriented north and south either to gain views of the ocean or, in this case, views of the bay. In 1904, this tract didn't exist yet, and this tract didn't exist. So all of these parcels here had basically views of the bay. These are consolidated parcels. This is, I think, the fire station or library. This is the Bay Island parking structure. And then there's a parcel here that has 2 of the lots that have been combined. This one here basically has three lots that were combined and could be reoriented to take advantage of views from the ocean. So all of these, if they don't, if they tear down and rebuild, most of these parcels that are shown here are going to need some type of discretionary approval, either a variance or a mod, or both, to rebuild. This is across from that tract. This is the map of Block A, done in 1906. Some of these odd-shaped lots were combined. This one, with 3 lots into 1 parcel. This was 6 lots into 3 parcels, and so forth. This one is the strangest of all. It has 2 portions of lots facing Montero and 2 portions of the back, which create another parcel. So it's access from, I think it's Medina Way. And this one here, there are 2 lots that are consolidated. They could be reoriented if that's what they wanted to do or try. And this is the next tract over. Again, there's a couple of parcels that basically have been combined and reoriented. So you have basically 2 ownerships side by side of these reoriented lots. Nothing there. West Balboa, we're going west from the East Bay. Again, you have a number of maps, again, starting in 1904, with this portion here, and then the others were in the 20s and 30s and 40s. This one has 2 lots that were combined. No change, that's a small tract. This is 15th Street. Across this is residential. Again, you have 2 lots that were combined and also have 1 building constructed across that lot line. Just another indicator of other parcels that basically have been consolidated. Balboa Bayside tract, which is basically between, what's this one next to? 804. All of these are consolidated parcels. They're not reoriented. Most of them have large structures on them. So they, if they're on the corner, they could conceivably tear them down and try to reorient some of the lots.
I think we can probably get the picture here, Jay.
Okay.
Probably move.
Good. Yeah,
Let's get to the meat of the argument here.
Newport Heights. Somebody raised a question on Newport Heights. There's only a smattering of those. Again, some of these are already reoriented. Some are consolidated. Santa Ana Heights, on annexation, we basically inherited some of these multiple parcels that were combined. This one had 2 lots that were combined and created 5, which now run north-south. Harbor Highlands. All of these are reverse frontage lots adopted by the original tract. There's quite a few. And I doubt that many of them really have our reverse frontage requirements because they were done through the county. Corona Del Mar, again, there's some consolidated and some reoriented lots.
Actually, since you're on Corona Del Mar, I seem to recall probably about 5 years ago, we had an issue where there was this similar kind of a situation where I think they had reoriented the house along the alleyway, and there was a setback there, and I believe even their use permit or however they got that building approved said that they couldn't have landscaping in the setback. You remember that? Couldn't have landscaping in the setback because that prevented the people across the alley from backing up and adequately using the alleyway. And I remember they came to us because, or there was a complaint, actually. The neighbor, I think, filed a complaint because they had planted trees there and bushes and landscaping and effectively took up the 5 feet and couldn't use it anymore. And I remember I voted against it, but the council approved allowing them to keep their landscaping because it did look nice. There was no doubt about it. But, I think it was unfortunate for the adjoining homeowner who had an expectation that they were going to remain having that 5 feet, that the other guy usurped it, and then he wound up getting the council at that time to approve it. So.
That lot still hasn't been built on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there's a difference that Public Works might place on whether it's shrubbery versus trees. Obviously, shrubbery is a little more forgiving, so you could back up into a shrub, but you couldn't into a tree.
No.
We have had issues with other parcel maps on the peninsula where they've come in, put in landscaping, we told them to take it out, they've taken it out, and then they come back and put it back in after we go away.
Right. It's an enforcement issue.
Yes. Again, these are just examples of other locations where you have reoriented lots that already exist. that section. Do you have any questions?
Okay, any questions, Jane?
Yeah, my question is, so why do we want to do this? I mean, it just seems like not a really great idea to me from what we've seen. You get problems with parking and problems with, I mean, if I'm a neighbor and I'm looking down the street, all of a sudden I've got a wall because of the notch, and so, but I'm obviously I'm missing something.
I think one of the differences has to do with the size of the lots. Obviously, here we presented the worst-case scenario with small lots where the setbacks take up a lot of room and basically create buildable area issues and access issues. If you have a standard 5,000 or 6,000 square foot lot, then those problems may not be the same.
Does staff have any recommendation on this? I know you're asking for guidance, but, I mean, you guys are the experts here. What's your recommendation on this?
Mayor and council members, this came up, we were already amending or working on revising Title 19, and a couple of questions came in. I know some council members, I think who were even on the planning commission maybe at the time, didn't realize, and we didn't realize that there was such a clear conflict between the council policy adopted in October of 2006 and the plan policies that were adopted a month later. And that was the question is, well, which one do we want to do? Do we want to allow parcels that have alley access to also have street access? Or do we allow lots to be created where both lots had alley access, we reorient them through a lot line adjustment, and now one of the parcels at the corner no longer has alley access? Do you want to allow another curb cut there? And that's how this presentation came up, to show you just what are the potential outcomes if you go ahead and change the policy in the general plan and the coastal land use plan to allow a reorientation to result in no alley access for one lot that previously had it, and then allow an additional curb cut. So by way of illustration, here's what happens. And yes, I know from Public Works and from General Services, the big thing is always the side street, because it's not only an issue of my neighbor across the alley being able to back out, or not being able to back out because now I have a wall right at the property line on the alley, but the trash trucks, the service trucks, constantly clipping those walls. I mean, that was the first thing I heard when I came here was, you got to do something about access at alleys, because the garbage trucks hit the walls.
Okay, you've given me this. Doesn't seem like a very good idea to me, but I'm not a builder or a developer, so perhaps there's a better argument that I'm missing.
I'll weigh in on this. I think some of this developed because of just the fact that we've got some policies in the general plan that are so precise and so strict that it doesn't leave much flexibility, and I think the staff was probably trying to find a way to give more flexibility and work around those general plan policies. And maybe what we ought to do, and we've run into this in the zoning code committee, is at a study session have the staff pull all the policies out of the general plan that are regulatory policies, because our new city attorney is taking the interpretation that these are tantamount to zoning. And I know that when I voted for the general plan, I never in my wildest dreams thought that we were going to be taking policies in the general plan and interpreting them as development regulations. So maybe we ought to be taking a look at all the ones that say required, because typically they say encourage, where feasible, things like that, and gives you the chance to develop supplemental regulations. But we're running into it in the zoning code rewrite, that we have one thing we're trying to deal with on environmentally sensitive areas that the general plan says you will do this, and we tried so many different ways to work around it, and it's not working out.
Well, I would just have a word of caution there, because sitting on the General Plan Advisory Committee, they were very thoughtful. And when they said shall, it was because they wanted it to be very, very strong, and they didn't want to be encouraging and that sort of thing. A number of cases. Now, I don't know about something like this particular thing, but particularly when it came to the environmental and the open space issues, there was a lot of discussion about the verb.
Well, I don't doubt that, but I think that if we really look back on how the general plan was adopted by the council, that a lot of this stuff that we were on a tight time schedule, that I don't think that we gave a lot of it as much consideration as we should have.
Well, I would just say that I think the reason that the general plan passed was because of its environmental policies, not because of the growth built into it, and we need to pay attention to those things.
Well, on a general basis, when I worked in city planning, zoning trumped general plan if there's an inconsistency, and we ruled by a lot of exceptions because of our unique topography and a lot of other reasons. So maybe that's why applicants like me so much, but that's how I administer things, and that was very consistent with how we did things.
Let me just add a little more color here. I think some things did slip through in the general plan that were unintended by way of prescriptive language like this, not necessarily related to environmental issues, but like this, zoning issues. And there are a number of problems. One of the problems is, and this is particularly common in my district, a 30 by 70 foot lot. In my view, it's patently ridiculous that there is a 20-foot setback requirement on a 30 by 70 foot lot. It practically prohibits, along with these other regulations, the development of a reasonable sized home on that lot, and it is inconsistent with the great preponderance of development that's already on the peninsula, which has less than 20-foot setbacks. And so that's an issue and a problem, and one that I would hope maybe someday we could get addressed, because it's just completely inappropriate to what's happening on the peninsula and with a reasonable use of the lot for the property owner. And then with regard to this issue of alley access and parking and whatnot, to me, it's quite reasonable in those few handfuls of situations, maybe even one handful of situations, where a single entity owns both lots and wants to reorient them. I don't know how many examples we've even got of that. We shouldn't wind up through our regulation requiring a parcel map and all sorts of approvals, coastal submission for what is a really pretty simple, innocuous thing, particularly if you can mitigate the impact on on-street parking by the requirement of above-code off-street parking. And so to me, all this is about is allowing a simple process for those handful of situations to be accommodated in those unique circumstances where it would be appropriate.
I hear what you're saying, Mike, but I guess I differ with you on that, and maybe some of the other council members here. We have these policies in the general plan, and for a reason. And, I see it as, yeah, we could accommodate, the extra space that we lose on the street in somebody's garage, maybe. I don't think so, with only 500 square feet left on the ground floor, unless you're putting in jacks or things like that. But regardless, you create now a curb cut on a sidewalk where pedestrians are walking, especially in the beach area where we have a lot of traffic, a lot of visitor traffic. So it's an inconvenience to other people. In some of these demonstrations that we had up here, we had, for instance, maybe the car, both lots getting alley access. So now you got a car going from the back of the alley to the house that fronts on the street. But what about the guy in the original, the lot just below? Now he's got cars going, past his bedroom windows, which are lining the back, the side of the house there. So he's inconvenienced. You have neighbors across the alleyway who are inconvenienced by walls that are being put up. And 15 feet, I have an expedition. I have a 20-foot alley with the 2 5-foot setbacks and 10 feet, and I need every bit of that 20 feet to get my car in and out of the garage, or even into the carport space that we have there. If I didn't have that extra 5 feet, I literally probably couldn't get my car in and out. So, I think it's to just have a blanket policy and just let people do the old switcheroo. I think it's great for them maybe, or for the developer who's building something and then is going to sell it off and move on to the next project. But all the people in that neighborhood or in the immediate surrounding area, they have to live with the effects of it, whatever those effects are.
But that's why you have an administrative approval process that is designed to allow for mitigation of some of those issues that are unique to that particular parcel.
Well, I don't think a lot of those issues can be mitigated, and I think it just places an undue burden on the adjoining property owners to accommodate a guy that wants to flip his lot that's been that way for 100 years. These maps he's showing us are from 1904, 105 years. So I think that there's an expectation when you move into a neighborhood that I can, my view is going to be sort of what it is, not that now some guy's going to build a building in front of my view, whatever that view may be. Maybe it's no view. Maybe he just likes to look up and down the street, but now he's got a building blocking it, or he's got a fence there or something else. So I'm really not in favor of making this type of an adjustment, whether we rush through the general plan or not. We're discussing it, I think, in depth here, And I just haven't seen a good justification for doing it. For the one or two situations that may possibly occur, they can always go through the parcel map process or do whatever they need to do to.
Well,
to
let me ask you this,
accomplish that.
because I think if, you know, there's a consensus that as a blanket citywide policy, it's a problem because of the impacts, but what about enabling an exception where it may be appropriate and can be mitigated? And then how would you, because it seems as if what's the impediment, part of the impediment to the exception is the general plan policy. So, I mean.
I personally, I don't have a problem with the general plan policy that requires alley access where alley access can be taken.
So you're taking the position that it's just completely inappropriate in all lots in the city versus generally inappropriate, but there may be an exception or two out there?
No, I haven't seen one yet. They haven't shown me one. You know, where
Particularly, my problem is when you combine what you have identified, Steve, with the general plan requirement for a 20-foot setback, it makes reasonable reuse of the property untenable. And that's what I have the difficulty with, when it's the combination of impacts of general plan policies that I don't think were all intended. I don't think there was enough thought about this 20-foot setback requirement in the peninsula and a lot of areas of Corona del Mar. I don't think it was very thoughtful at all. So,
well, the 20-foot setback
combined
is.
effect of these policies is what creates an inequitable situation for which there ought to be a simple exception procedure.
Is the 20-foot setback policy in the general plan? Is that where
No.
that comes from?
No, it's in the zoning code.
So that's the zoning code. It has nothing to do with the general plan. That's, we could change that if we want or not change it. I mean, that's a whole bunch of other expectations, the 20-foot setback. To me, that doesn't even really come into play with
I think Sharon
regard to
has something to say.
this.
Well, I wanted to clarify that, so thank you, Councilmember Rosansky. But I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that revisiting the setbacks on the districting maps in the zoning code would be an easy thing to do, because we considered that when we started with the zoning code rewrite, and the staff started poring over them, and there's such a history to them that trying to redo that system would be a pretty massive effort unto itself, and I don't know if we could do it equitably.
There's no consistent philosophy behind those setbacks.
No.
Okay, well, I think, Mike, that you're confusing, or, I mean, not confusing, but I think that the 20-foot setback issue, I agree with you that as is shown in all the existing lots on the peninsula, not very many of them have a 20-foot setback. And so I think that trying to tie that into the reorientation of the lots there's a fallacy there, because the reorientation of the lots, the staff has done an excellent job of showing all the reasons why it shouldn't be done and why the general plan has specifically said that it shouldn't be done. And I think that I disagree that we should go forward and make it easier to do that. I think that we should not allow that reorientation to occur under a simple process. If it goes through, it's got to be through some sort of map or something that has full review and approval of the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council by appeal.
Okay, well, I think
I've sort of lost my enthusiasm to extend this discussion any further.
We wore you down, huh?
Well, why don't we?
It was Jay
do
with
this?
those maps. He
I think
did
we
it.
have other things to talk about tonight.
Well, why don't we do this?
I
Why don't we
am grossly impressed, really magnificently impressed with your knowledge of the zoning of this city, Jay.
Okay, do you want to take a straw vote on whether we leave these provisions in or out? Because the staff needs some directions, because there's other amendments they're doing to Title 19. So I'll start with you, Councilman Henn. You want to leave it in or out?
Well, I want to leave it in.
Okay.
Out.
Councilman
We're
Curtis.
talking about the lot line adjustment?
Right,
Is that-
just the
yeah,
lot line
out.
adjustment.
Well, I may be the only person up here that has strong feelings about this, but I would generally say let's leave them in because I think we need the flexibility for specific situations. But I am persuaded by the presentation that generally it's not a good idea.
Okay, I say leave it in, Councilman. Okay, so it's out. Okay, any public comments on the Title 19? Seeing none, any public comments on non-agenda items? Okay.
Look at it this way,
Close.
anything you snuck through in the other Title 19 things, you did a good job.
That's what you always do. You throw one ringer in. You throw one ringer in, and all the rest of the stuff goes through. Okay, we're adjourned to closed session.
I was a lost leader.